Here's the key to monetizing your podcast. If you don't tell people it costs something, they won't ask.
I'm Ileana Landon, and you're listening to Trailblazers, the podcast for sound media professionals. On this episode of Trailblazers, we talk to Tom Fox, who is the founder of the Compliance Podcast Network and the Texas Hill Country Podcast Network. He's won multiple awards for both podcast hosting and producing. We'll get right to the interview after a brief word from our sponsor.
Why use a cookie-cutter production music service? Your radio station can do better than that. Why not have imaging and branding your way? WizFX builds your audio brand so you can get something that fits your needs perfectly. Call Megatrax for your product demo trial at +818 255 7172.
So you've been on the forefront of compliance conversations for quite some time. What initially drew you into the world of compliance, and how did that lead you to start the Compliance Podcast Network?
So my last corporate position, I was with a company that had violated a U.S. law, which prevents U.S. companies from paying bribes outside the United States. It's called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And I was part of the new management team that was brought in to build out a compliance program inside the corporation. I did that for a couple of years until the company was sold and my job went away. And I decided what I really wanted to do with my life was race bicycles. So I went off on this great adventure to race bicycles. I was over 50. I could ride in the senior division, got in great shape, lost a lot of weight, had a lot of fun, until one training ride, I was hit by a Hummer. That ended my cycling career. After I convalesced for a few months, when I got the energy to get on my walker and toddle into my office, I realized I was going to have to go back to work. And so, as one does when one has a life-changing event, you have a lot of time to think. And so I decided that I should just do what I wanted to do. And what I really enjoyed was building compliance programs inside of corporations. So this was 2010, and there were very few lawyers in private practice who did that back then. There were lawyers who were in compliance, but they had either did investigations or negotiated with the government. So I started doing that, but I had no work and I had no clients. And the only thing I had on my hands was time. So at that point in my life, I knew nothing about social media. So I got on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and started exploring social media. And I was so banged up that I couldn't leave my house, or rather the only time I left my house was to go to physical therapy. So I couldn't go to a conference, couldn't go to a meeting, couldn't go give a speech, couldn't go have a drink, couldn't go have a dinner, couldn't go meet with a client, any of that.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I mean, I've known you now for a couple of years and I didn't know this story. Thank you so much for sharing this part. Oh my goodness.
We haven't gotten to the good part yet.
I'm so sorry you had to go through all of this. Honestly, I am.
It was a blessing in disguise. At any rate, within 6 months, and I just worked out of my home. And this is, obviously long before COVID and work from home, but I built this worldwide consulting practice literally out of my house.
Wow.
After 6 months or so of convalescence out of the hospital, I finally could get around on crutches and a cane, and I started going to conferences and started picking up a lot of work. As part of that marketing effort to create that consulting company, I started blogging. And it was the blogging that led to podcasting. It was just a natural social media marketing extension.
Wow.
So I started podcasting in 2012. So that's how I got to podcasting. It was an extension of blogging, which was a type of social media marketing that I was doing, because when I started all this in 2010, like I said, the only thing I had on my hands was time. But the other thing was I had no money. So whatever I did, it had to be at no cost to me. And so for $100 back then, you could get on WordPress. And so I just started blogging every day. And that's how it all started.
Wow. What a great story. My goodness. I'm glad you're up and attending conferences, because that's how I've met you. So,
right?
Yeah, I mean, that's incredible. What a life-changing event, and what a way to turn your life around in a way that enabled you to heal and enabled you to earn an income. Good for you. I love savvy people who figure things out. When the going gets tough, the tough get going.
Well, the biggest lesson I learned from all of that is The first part of this next statement I knew, which is if the universe closes one door, it always opens another.
Yes.
But I didn't appreciate it until that event was you have to have the courage to walk through it.
Absolutely.
And I'd never had that courage before, but I did after having a life-threatening event. I
Wow.
said, bleep it, I'm doing it.
I'm in awe. I mean, I was already in awe with how much you've grown your network since we first met. But now I'm even in more awe. My respects to you, honestly. So on to the next question. The role of compliance seems to be expanding, and especially with evolving regulations, come corporate challenges. So what would you say are the most pressing compliance issues facing businesses today?
The most pressing compliance issues are, it's not whether or not to have a compliance program. You have to have a compliance program. You have to have one to meet the regulatory requirements. But the other part is literally to do business, you have to have a compliance program. And the best example I can give you is I practiced for 40 years in the energy space. So I've been around energy companies. Well, if you want to do any work in the energy company space with any of the big boys, no matter how big or small you are, you have to have a compliance program because they want to be satisfied that the company they're doing business with, whether as a customer or a vendor or an agent, sales agent, is doing business ethically and in compliance. So it's a requirement to do business. And then the third part of that is we've got regulatory, we've got the commercial. But if you want to get any investment dollars, whether it's private equity money, whether it's a bank loan, whether it's the sale of stock on a stock exchange or something else, you have to have a compliance program. So it's really that all three legs of that stool now mandate that businesses have a compliance program. So that's part one. But part two is, since the pandemic, when things, dramatically changed in every area of business, compliance included, a lot more emphasis now on data and data analytics. And so I'm a lawyer, obviously, by professional background, and the lawyers running compliance is less and less now. We're having a lot more engineers, a lot more process engineers, a lot more data scientists, a lot more people comfortable with data in a way that I certainly am not coming into compliance. So the field is expanding, and it's a great example of how diversity actually makes compliance better, because when you had a bunch of lawyers looking at a problem, we all came up with the same answer. If you have an engineer, or you have a data scientist, or you have a human resource specialist, or you have a behavioral psychologist look at a problem, they're going to come up with a different way to address it. And when you can incorporate all of those into compliance, you're going to have a better compliance program.
What are some examples of some compliance issues that perhaps a company like Megatrax that has, employees working mostly remotely, what are some of the things that a business or a broadcaster or a podcaster might need to know?
Sure. So you've upset my dog with that question so much. So first of all, you can have the general counsel of Megatrax call me. But some of the things that working from home that you might not think of, and the first example, my wife worked at an energy company in Houston until the pandemic. And of course, like everyone else, she was working from home. Mm-hmm. She gets an email one day from one of the biggest vendors of the company. She worked in IT. And the vendor said, "Can you give us your home address?" And she asked me about it. And I said, "Well, that's odd. Let's see what they're going to send you." Well, they sent her a DoorDash coupon, which, is pretty benign. Mm-hmm. The amount of the DoorDash coupon was for $75. Mm-hmm. Well, I knew what the gift limit was from vendors to people in her company. And it was not $75. It was far below that. Mm-hmm. And if that had been delivered in the office, it would have been rejected. She would have had to say, "No, I can't accept mm-hmm. that." And there would have been a log of the vendor coming into the office. Literally, they mailed it to her at home. There was no record of that. So one, you actually have greater potential violation of your own gifts to your own employees, because if something's mailed to someone's private residence, company's never going to know. That's one example. A second example is data security. When my wife worked at the office, she had, of course, had a laptop and, of course, logged in at the office, behind the firewall at the office. She brought her laptop home every night for security reasons, so no one would steal it. But she didn't work at home back then. And once she got home, it was she and I. Well, when she started working from home, she was obviously at home. And so a whole new set of data security issues arose because it was not a VPN. She could log into a VPN, but she had to log in through our internet at home. So data security and data privacy became a much bigger issue for every company that wasn't set up to protect their data in that way. So those are just a couple examples of moving from working in the office to working, as we all did, work from home, to some sort of hybrid model now.
That's really great for people to know. And, at the end of the podcast, we're going to give you Tom's contact information because I'm sure many of the broadcasters and podcasters might want to check in with you to see if they're in compliance. What kind of impact do you hope your podcasts on compliance are having in the world? Are they standout stories where your content maybe made a direct difference for professionals or companies? Or is it something that's more of a proactive and kind of reactive measure?
It's a combination of those two plus one other. When I started this practice in 2010, I wanted to be the nuts and bolts guy. I wanted to help in-house compliance professionals build out compliance programs and run those compliance programs. So that's still my number one focus is the in-house compliance professional. My audience is about 40% in-house compliance professionals, 40% other business executives, and about 20% legal types, both in-house lawyers and those in private practice. That's number one. Number two is trying to show that effective compliance equates to more efficient business processes, equates to greater ROI. So I try to demonstrate through tech solutions, through data analytics, now through AI and ChatGPT, that you're making your compliance program more effective actually does not stifle innovation. It makes you more business efficient and hopefully at the end of the day, more profitable. So there's a series of podcasts on that. And then I do passion projects. And I would say in the compliance world, my biggest passion project was Star Trek, the original series. I did all 79 episodes focusing on compliance and business leadership. I called it Trekking Through Compliance. I'm a huge Star Trek fan. I've done that with Star Wars. I've done that with a full MCU. I've done that with James Joyce and Ulysses, Winnie the Pooh, Sports and Compliance, Paradise Lost and Compliance. It's the 100th anniversary of the death of Franz Kafka, if you know who that author is.
Wow.
I'm doing Kafka in compliance. I do Shakespeare in compliance. I'm currently reading every Sherlock Holmes short story or Sherlock Holmes in compliance. So it's an excuse for me to explore all of these interests I have from the compliance angle.
Oh, I love that. And I can attest that you are a Trekkie because you were wearing a shirt at this last podcast movement a couple of weeks ago.
That I am.
So the Compliance Podcast Network, it's a powerful platform with a lot of different series. Could you walk us through some different podcasts that you do produce? I know you mentioned a few of the subjects, but can you explain the unique angle maybe of like 2 or 3 where each one brings the compliance discussion?
Sure. So I'll just go through kind of the days of the week. So Monday, we have the daily compliance news, which is just that 4 curated stories. That's about 5 minutes. We have a daily compliance tip of the day. So that's called Compliance Tip of the Day. And it's one tip that you can incorporate into your compliance program at little or no cost per day. And that's usually about 8 minutes long. Then my oldest podcast is called the FCPA Compliance Report. I mentioned that's the law that says you can't engage in bribery and corruption outside the United States. So I have those are interviews. On Tuesday, I have Innovation in Compliance, where although the word compliance is on the title, it's really about innovation. So anything innovative, particularly things that are not compliance, that I can get compliance officers to think about that might make their compliance program more innovative. Wednesday, well, in fact, you're going to go on that podcast because I'm going to have you talk about Megatrax and the services you offer, because frankly, compliance officers never think about putting background music on any of their communications. Well, it turns out people like that. And just because I'm doing that in a podcast does not mean you cannot do that in the corporate world. So there. Wednesday, we have...
I like that example, by the way.
Good. We have Great Women in Compliance, which is just that, a women-only podcast. Although every once in a while I have a male, but it's women talking to women about working in the field of compliance. I have Compliance Into the Weeds, where with a colleague, we take a deep dive into some subject that interests us. On Thursday, I have a couple of different podcasts. I have one that looks at data privacy and data protection issues in Europe under the GDPR, Europe's law on that topic. I have something called Everything Compliance, which is my only roundtable panel podcast. It's for compliance professionals, and we take up multiple topics from a panel perspective. On Friday, I have something called Creativity and Compliance, and that focuses on communication and training. And my partner in that is actually a former stand-up comedian who started doing training videos based on stand-up. And he's developed an entire business around communications of compliance topics, based on his prior professional work. On Saturday, I do a roundup of all the news called 10 for 10 curated stories. And on Sunday, I do the Sunday book review, which is 4 books that would interest the compliance practitioner or me that I do. So that's sort of a snapshot of the week in the Compliance Podcast Network.
Wow. Do you ever sleep?
A little bit.
Oh my goodness. So the daily podcasts, they can be really demanding in terms of staying current. What kind of a team or tools do you rely on to make sure that you as a podcast network are providing, timely and relevant compliance issues and updates every day?
Well, I'm the team, so I have lots of tech tools that help me. But in terms of the news, it's called Google. And you type in corruption and you get stories. But I also subscribe to all the major newspapers electronically. So although I live in a rural part of West Texas, I read the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Financial Times, sometimes the Washington Post, literally every day. So I get all of my stories from there. Of course, you can get a Google alert or other breaking news. Sometimes it's compliance related. So getting the news is not the problem. And the problem is getting that information turned around in a podcast format out to my listeners.
I know that you mentioned you also kind of replaced some local newspapers that maybe went belly up and that you have just local news podcasts. Can you tell us a little bit about what kind of content you create in these podcasts?
Sure. So I actually have 2 networks. I have the Compliance Podcast Network, and I live in a rural part of West Texas called the Texas Hill Country. So I have the Texas Hill Country Podcast Network. Actually, I drew inspiration from a guy who did just what you said. There was a fellow who's moved here just after I did, and he started a Facebook show, and it's basically just a daily radio show, except he did it on Facebook. And it was just local interest. And I thought, well, that's just brilliant. Because my town is too small to have TV. It's too small to have its own radio station. We have 3-day-a-week newspaper service. So getting news is difficult. Mm-hmm. The county I live in is 38% 65 or over. And they're all on Facebook. And they're all listening. So I thought, I can reach people via Facebook. So I started just a couple of podcasts that were human interest stories where I would just sit down and ask someone to tell me their story. Mm-hmm. And that was really the genesis of the network. And now we have 15 different podcasts on the network. We have a Hill Country podcast. We have a Hill Country Authors podcast. I won a couple of awards for the Hill Country Artists podcast. We have a Financial Advisors podcast. We have a Beating Diabetes Through Exercise podcast. We have a couple of business consultants who are on our network. There's a small local liberal arts university. They're on our network. The local school districts, I've convinced them to start student-led podcasts.
Wow.
So each of the school districts has a podcast on my network, and we're just trying to build out a local network to tell local stories to local people. So we're going to see if we can make that work.
That is brilliant. And I'm super excited. I want to bring you back maybe a year from now so that you can update us on, on how that network is growing. Because I know you grew your compliance network almost overnight. I mean, it seems like it. I think the last time I saw you, you mentioned that you had 12 podcasts or something like that. And now how many between your 2 networks How many podcasts are you producing currently?
So 660 on the Compliance Podcast Network and 12 on the Texas Hill Country Podcast Network.
Incredible.
Are you monetizing all of these podcasts with ads, or how are you making money to feed back in to make more podcasts?
Sure. So I have 5 avenues or revenue streams. Number 1 is appearance fee. If someone wants to come on, I charge an appearance fee. Number 2 is sponsor an individual podcast. So particularly on the Compliance Podcast Network, product providers will want to sponsor an episode because they get an ad read and then have one of their members be a guest. So that's appearance fee and sponsorship. You can sponsor a series of podcasts. So the FCPA Compliance Report or Innovation and Compliance currently has a sponsor for the month of September. You can sponsor the whole network. So I have a whole network sponsor. And then the largest revenue source on the Compliance Podcast Network side of things are product providers will pay me to create content for them in the podcast format. So I have a 5-part podcast series package, and companies will do that. Each podcast is relatively short at 15 minutes. That's by design. So we have 1 or maybe 2 topics, but that's only half of what they get, because with each podcast, I create 4 videograms for social media sharing assets. I write a blog post. At the end of the 5 parts, I re-edit the blog post into a long-form white paper. I write out all the social media shares for them, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram. I'm not on TikTok, but they're free to use it if they want. So they're getting about 35 pieces of evergreen social media marketing content. These companies are usually large enough to have a CMO, but not large enough to have a real content creation team. So when they do a podcast series with me, they get the podcast and thought leadership and relationship building part of podcasting, but equally important is the social media marketing content creation that they use. The model is a little bit different for the local network. I knew what the newspaper charged for an ad was $500. And I said, well, I can produce a podcast a lot cheaper than that. So I just cut my price below $500 and I charge them that much an episode, and they're happy to get it.
That's great info for other podcasters or, freelancers or media producers. It's interesting, your approach to monetizing. And like Eliana said, when do you sleep?
Here's the key to monetizing your podcast. If you don't tell people it costs something, they won't ask. My wife beat me over the head for years saying, you got to charge appearance fees. You got to charge appearance fees. And I said, nobody will come on. Well, I think it was 2 years ago, I started, I told somebody, okay, it's $250 to come on the pod. That lasted 3 months and it went to $350. And that lasted 3 weeks and went to $500.
Wow.
And about 6 months later, I moved it to $1,000. Well, $1,000 was too much. And so the market kind of set the rate they were comfortable with. And if you have, as many podcasts as I have, obviously, but if you have 4 people paying $500 a month, that's not a bad little nest egg to start with.
And do you have to prove your numbers, or are people willing just based on the quality of your podcast? Or do you need to go, here's my audience, here's my reach?
Last year, I cracked the code on all numbers on social media platforms. My IAB certified downloads were never high. They were usually about 30,000 a month for the whole network. And so I knew in the field of compliance, I was never going to have, obviously, Joe Rogan or Bill Simmons numbers. But IAB certified, it turns out, is a very small part of your overall engagement. So Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, non-IAB certified platforms, web-based, all of those. And I finally figured out how to get auditable, meaning I can show them where the numbers came from, transparent numbers. And so in 2023, I had 500,000 IAB certified downloads across the whole network. I had 7.2 million pieces of engagement, meaning a listener had touched a podcast somewhere, somehow.
That's pretty amazing. We need a service that aggregates all that.
Somebody should do that. And the problem is nobody calls it the same thing. So IAB certified is not a listen. It's an IAB certified download. And if you're non-IAB certified download, that's a different name. Well, then there's impressions, then there's engagements, and we can't even get the terminology that we can use across that. So it's frustrating. I'm sure it's frustrating for someone trying to, get real numbers just because nobody's got anything coherent. And I've finally cracked this code. So I can show them the numbers. I know the demographics of my audience. I know US versus non-US. I know the verticals in business that break down, that listen to me. So there are some services that can give you that. And I would hope that they accept the quality as well.
Yeah, I agree. That was one of my first thoughts, that radio and television has Nielsen. And of course, Nielsen does podcast measurement too, but it does not include, like what you said, the media impressions, all of that. And it has to be standardized so that you can monetize and be able to sell all those touches, because all of those in digital media, it's measured on touches. So someone might see an ad, but not really buy anything, but it's still a touch. You know, they got the message, they learned about the sponsor. So it's definitely something that needs to happen. And I'm going to share this with my Nielsen contact and see if maybe, they can talk about how or what their plans are to maybe wrangling everything into one measurement.
Yeah. And then, we've got, I think it's iTunes. iTunes or Apple have announced they're going to web-based only. You're not even get a download from them. And you're just going to have a category of Apple Podcasts. What does that mean? Who knows? So we're still trying to figure it all out, I think.
A lot to figure out still, but I salute you because you were able to figure all of this out as a result of a life-changing event. It's really incredible. My hat's off to you, Tom.
Well, COVID helped a lot.
Yes, it helped a lot in many ways, I guess.
It's not often you hear that statement, but...
Well, and the reason was in the world of compliance, pre-COVID, almost all marketing was done in person, whether it was a trade show, conference, breakfast roundtable, a dinner, or something. And of course, that ended during COVID. And in the middle of COVID, all of these compliance product providers were calling me saying, how do we get access to your network? Well, even at that point in time, I had the largest social media presence in compliance. And then in August of 2020, I had my first 200,000 download month. So it blew up.
What do you think was the greatest contributor to your growth besides COVID? Did you do any special marketing? How did you go from like 0 to 200,000 downloads?
Two things. One was I went as narrow and niche as I could. And legal and regulatory compliance is just that. It's very narrow, very niche. And so I was the first podcaster in the compliance space. I had the first network in compliance. And so I sort of owned that space in compliance. That was part one. By going niche, I went very, very large. Part two was the year before COVID hit, I had made the decision that I either had to fully commit to the network or I had to move it to hobby status. So I quit practicing law. I hired every vendor I could find. We built this huge network, bought all the cool toys. I have a great in-home studio. And at the end of the year, I'd made about $10,000. And I thought, well, that was an interesting experiment. I guess I have to go back to being a lawyer. And all of that ended when they shut the country down. But what happened was, because of that work I'd done in 2019, when I started getting those calls, which was how long to get access to your network, the answer to everyone was 24 hours, because it was literally just a drop and drag.
Wow.
And so one of my favorite phrases is, when preparation meets opportunity, luck occurs. And that's literally what happened to me. Because if I hadn't done that work in 2019, maybe I could have done it, maybe not, but I don't have to answer that question, because I had this huge infrastructure and I needed content, and it just slid right in.
That's wonderful. I'm really happy for you, Tom. So as you continue to build out both networks, are there any new projects or formats or different directions that you're going to take your podcast networks towards?
So I'm really interested in the rural network, because the economic model for that type of network was one large anchor podcast, hunting or fishing or something, that paid for everything else. Well, I didn't ever think I was going to have a national podcast of general interest that would generate that kind of money. So I wanted to see, if I charge people $500 or $1,000 a month, can I get up to $10,000 a month, or can I get up to $15,000 a month? Convincing local business people in a town of 20,000 that social media marketing is a way for you to go because your customers are on social media.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm really intrigued to see if I can convince businesses of that fact, and it is a fact. So that's where I'm going to try and take that network. But it's not that it's rural, it's that it's a defined area. So wherever you live, you could have a podcast network for your neighborhood. You could have a podcast network for your county. You could have a podcast network for your part of town. And I think there's some value in that. You know, it's obviously not Joe Rogan, but it's $10,000 or $15,000 a month is not bad.
Absolutely.
Number one. And the thing I love, Ileana, is I'm inherently and intensely curious. So I love to do new things, and I love to do things that interest me. And that's Star Trek, Star Wars, and you name everything else. And so what I'm going to try to do is I'm a big believer in repurposing of your content.
Mm-hmm.
And with the tools available to you as a podcaster now, you get a transcript, obviously, for every podcast. Well, that transcript can be the basis of a blog post. It can be the basis of a white chapter. I've had multiple podcast transcripts be the basis of a chapter of a book. So it allows me to write 3 to 4 books a year. I'm currently working on a book on, compliance lessons from Star Trek. So I'm just having as much fun as one can.
I mean, the first time I met you, I knew you had that curiosity because you asked me a lot of questions, and usually it's me asking them. So that curiosity, I think, is absolutely critical for any kind of success, because if you're not curious about learning or growing or trying new things, you stay stuck. That's partly why I started this podcast. Was my curiosity. I wanted to learn from broadcasters and podcasters alike, like what makes them tick, what makes them get up every morning, what are some of the things that they do day in and day out that maybe can help somebody else.
Absolutely.
And finally, for listeners, Tom, what would you say is the biggest takeaway that they should take from you and what you've learned by growing 2 networks?
I have 2 metrics and 2 metrics only for a successful podcast. Number 1, how much did I learn? And number 2, how much fun did I have? That's it.
Good for you.
The reason it's those metrics is if I've learned something about compliance from a guest, and I learn from every guest, then my audience is going to learn something. Number 2 is if I'm having fun, it comes across in the podcast. And they say people come for the guest and they stay for the host. Well, when they hear me having fun, I think they should have fun. And without sounding too much like a student bringing the apple to the teacher, it's the entire audio experience, including your intro and outro music. So go to Megatracks and check out some of the great music they have, because that adds to the overall audio experience.
Well done.
Oh, we like you, Tom. I liked you to begin with, and now you just went up to the top notch there.
Because it's a package of audio experience, and it's audio. It's not television, obviously. It's not the printed word. It's unique. And I think studies have shown that people trust audio more than even television for business content, certainly content. And I think for business content. So when you put a pleasing and enjoyable package together, the music that goes in my podcast that I get from Megatrack, it's music I like. Imagine that. So it's a full package, but your intro and outro music, any music you might put in a mid-roll, it's all part of the package that gives the user a pleasurable audio experience.
Wow, I was not waiting for that response. Thank you. That's like, I couldn't ask for a better referral and a better quote. Thank you. How do people get a hold of you, Tom?
Sure. So all of my podcasts are all the top platforms. You can go to the Compliance Podcast Network, which is www.compliancepodcastnetwork.net. The Rural Podcast Network is the Texas Hill Country Podcast Network.com. You can reach me through both of those sites. I'm on LinkedIn, Thomas R. Fox. Happy to connect with you. And you can email me if you have any questions about anything that's come up in this podcast. I'm at tfox@tfoxlaw.com.
Incredible. You've been such an inspiration. And, I think that the fact that you shared so many points of how you're succeeding, a lot of people try to hold that close to the chest because they want to succeed and they don't want others to succeed. And I salute you for being able to be so open about your successes and sharing those with maybe somebody who's struggling and listening to this podcast. And kudos to you and your success. And everybody go to his websites and check him out.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Trailblazers, the podcast for sound media professionals. We invite you to subscribe to Trailblazers anywhere podcasts are found. Our theme music is brought to you by Megatrax Production Music. Our engineer and producer is Lucas Fackler. Coordination and booking by Leo Salazar. I'm Ileana Landon, the host of Trailblazers, a Megatrax production. See you next time.
Why use a cookie-cutter production music service? Your radio station can do better than that. Why not have imaging and branding your way? WizFX builds your audio brand so you can get something that fits your needs perfectly. Crafted with you in mind and based on your station's playlist, we customize your station's sound. No, we're not some pretentious tailoring outfit, just a team of creatives who cringe at the words, "that'll do." Thousands of audio files at your fingertips. Fresh custom music, sound design, ready-to-use work parts, promo shells, sweepers, artist shoutouts, SFX, and more. If we use it, you've got access to it, alongside your custom production. Your imaging, your way. Head on over to wizfx.com. That's wizfx.com. WIZZFX.com to listen to samples for your format, or call Megatrax for your product demo trial at +818 255 7172. That's +818 255 7172. Or head over to megatrax.com. That's MEGATRAX.com.